There are moments in life that split everything into two halves. The before and the after. The morning before the phone call. The second before the door opens. The breath before the words leave someone's mouth and permanently change the air in the room. Most people spend their entire lives hoping they never have to live through one of those moments. Sarah Brooks lived through several of them in the span of a single year. And by the time it was over, she had lost things she could never fully recover, found things she never expected to find, and raised a son who, against every prediction, against every whispered doubt, against every cruel and careless word spoken in rooms he was too small to understand, turned out to be the most extraordinary thing any of them had ever witnessed. This is her story. And it begins, as so many stories do, not with a dramatic event or a sudden crisis, but with something quieter and more dangerous than either of those things. It begins with a woman who smiled at a wedding and said nothing, and waited. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah Michelle Carter grew up in a mid-sized suburb just outside Columbus, Ohio, the second of 3 children born to Robert and Diane Carter. Her father taught high school history for 30 years. Her mother was a registered nurse who worked long shifts and came home smelling like antiseptic, and still somehow managed to have dinner on the table most nights by 7. Sarah grew up watching her mother move through the world with a kind of quiet competence that she would spend her entire adult life trying to emulate. She was not the loudest person in any room she entered. She was not the one telling the biggest story or demanding the most attention. She was the one who noticed when someone at the edge of the room looked uncomfortable and moved toward them. She was the one who remembered birthdays and followed up on bad news, and showed up with food when someone was grieving before anyone else had thought to do it. Her high school friends described her years later as the kind of person you did not realize you depended on until she was not there. That kind of person. The foundational kind. She studied nursing at Ohio State University, following her mother's path without ever feeling that it was not her own choice. She graduated in 2010 with honors and took a position at a mid-sized hospital in Columbus, specifically requesting placement in the pediatric ward. That choice said something about her that she never had to say out loud. She had chosen to spend her working hours with the most vulnerable patients in the building. The ones who could not always explain where it hurt. The ones whose fear came out sideways in behavior that required patience and steadiness and genuine care to interpret correctly. Her supervisors noted early that she had an unusual ability to calm children who had been frightened by procedures, that she spoke to them at their level without being condescending, that families trusted her quickly and completely. She was not performing the job. She was living it. It was at a mutual friend's birthday gathering in the spring of 2012 that Sarah met Daniel Brooks for the first time. He was 31 years old, working as a structural engineer for a downtown Columbus firm, and by every account from people who knew him then, he was the kind of man who made a strong first impression for all the right reasons. He was warm without being overwhelming. He was funny without trying too hard. He listened when other people spoke, which is rarer than it should be. He had grown up in Cincinnati as the only child of Margaret Brooks, a woman who had raised him entirely on her own after his father Raymond died of a sudden heart attack when Daniel was 9 years old. That loss had shaped Daniel in ways both visible and invisible. It had made him serious about loyalty. It had made him careful with the people he loved. It had made him, in the view of almost everyone who knew him well, one of the good ones. Sarah thought so too. She was right, mostly. The complications came later. And they did not come from Daniel alone. Their relationship moved the way good relationships move when two people are genuinely suited to each other. Steadily, without drama. With the kind of momentum that feels less like falling and more like arriving somewhere you did not know you had been heading. They were living together by the end of 2013. Daniel proposed in early 2015 at the Italian restaurant they had been returning to since their first real date. Sarah said yes before he finished the sentence. The wedding was held outdoors in June of 2016, small and unpretentious, full of people who actually knew them. Everyone who attended said the same thing afterward. It felt real. Not performed. Not curated for photographs. Just two people who had made a genuine decision about each other and wanted the people they loved to witness it. What almost no one talked about that day, not openly, not where Sarah could hear, was Margaret Brooks. Margaret had been the central figure in Daniel's life for over 2 decades. When Raymond died and left her with a 9-year-old and a modest life insurance policy, she had done what many people called remarkable things. She worked 2 jobs for years. She kept the house. She made sure Daniel had what he needed and most of what he wanted, and never once let him feel the full weight of how hard she was working to make that possible. She had poured herself so completely into the project of raising him that when he grew up and chose a life of his own, something in Margaret genuinely did not know where to go. Daniel was not just her son. He was her identity. He was the thing she had organized herself around for 22 years. And now there was a woman who held his attention and his heart and his future in ways that Margaret could not compete with, no matter how many phone calls she made or how many dinners she hosted or how many subtle and not so subtle reminders she offered that she had been there first and longest and most completely. Sarah noticed the signs early. She was perceptive by nature and sharper by profession, and she recognized the particular shape of Margaret's behavior from the beginning. The compliments that always had a small blade buried somewhere inside them. The calls that came at inconvenient hours with perfectly reasonable explanations that somehow always managed to pull Daniel slightly away from the life he was building with Sarah and slightly back into the life Margaret preferred him to be living. The questions about their finances and their plans and their choices, not asked with curiosity but with the particular brand of concern that was really about control dressed in the language of love. Sarah said very little about any of it in those early years. She was patient. She gave Margaret the benefit of the doubt repeatedly and consistently, and with far more generosity than the situation probably warranted. She told herself that Margaret was a widow, that Daniel was all she had, that adjustment took time, and that kindness and consistency on Sarah's part would eventually produce something workable between them. She believed that because she wanted to believe it, and because she was the kind of person who kept trying long after most people would have stopped. By the spring of 2019, Sarah was pregnant with their first child. The announcement was everything it should have been. Her parents cried. Daniel practically levitated for the better part of a week. Their closest friends descended on them with champagne and noise and warmth. Even Margaret seemed to soften in those early weeks. The calls changed in tone. She asked about Sarah's health in ways that actually sounded like caring. She sent a card after the first ultrasound. Sarah allowed herself, carefully and with full awareness of the risk, to believe that a grandchild might be the thing that finally shifted the dynamic between them. That love for the baby might become, by extension, something softer and steadier between them. It was a reasonable hope. Turned out to be wrong. The pregnancy moved normally through the first 2 trimesters. Sarah attended every appointment, asked every appropriate question, tracked every development with the informed vigilance of someone who knew enough about medicine to know exactly what to watch for. But at 28 weeks, during a routine anatomy scan, the attending physician paused over something on the screen. He measured it twice. He excused himself to consult a colleague. When he returned and sat down in that particular deliberate way that medical professionals sit when they are about to change the emotional temperature of a room, he told Sarah and Daniel, gently, carefully, honestly, that there were findings suggesting their son might have a condition affecting his neurological development.
Your baby has a neurologic problem,
further testing would be needed. But the indicators were clear enough to take seriously. Sarah held Daniel's hand in the car on the way home and did not cry. She was a nurse. She knew how to hold herself together in the middle of information that was trying to take her apart. But when they got home and somehow ended up on the kitchen floor, neither of them could later explain exactly how that happened. The tears came. And in the middle of them, in the middle of all of it, Sarah said something to Daniel that he would repeat many times in the years that followed whenever anyone asked him what his wife was made of. She said, "Whatever he needs, we give him. That is the whole plan." They held each other on that floor. They grieved what they had imagined and began, slowly and together, to make room for what was real. The full diagnosis arrived at 32 weeks. Their son would be born with cerebral palsy, primarily affecting the left side of his body. The scope of the impact on his motor function, his speech, and his development would not be entirely clear until after birth and through the early years. The doctors were honest without being devastating. They spoke about early intervention, about therapy, about the many children with similar diagnoses who had grown into full and meaningful lives. Sarah and Daniel left that appointment with a diagnosis held not as a sentence but as a map, something to navigate, something to meet with everything they had. something that changed the shape of what was coming without canceling the destination. They told their families. Sarah's parents responded immediately and practically and lovingly, asking how they could help, when they could come, what was needed. There were tears and there were prayers and there were long evening phone calls that left Sarah feeling less alone than she had feared. And then they told Margaret. Daniel made that call on a Tuesday evening with Sarah sitting beside him, watching his face, watching him choose each word with the care of someone defusing something he was not entirely sure was safe. There was a long silence on the other end when he finished. Not the silence of someone absorbing grief. A different silence. Loaded and still. And then Margaret spoke. And what she said, 5 words delivered without hesitation, stated as fact rather than asked as question, Sarah would carry for years. Margaret said. This must have come from her side. Daniel said nothing. The conversation moved on. And something in Sarah moved too, quietly and permanently, in the direction of understanding exactly where she stood. Thomas Daniel Brooks was born on a Thursday morning in November of 2019. 7 pounds 4 ounces. Daniel's nose. Sarah's eyes. A full head of dark hair that every nurse who came through the room felt the need to comment on. Sarah held him and felt something she had not been prepared for. Not just love, which she had expected, but recognition. As though he had been navigating toward her specifically through all the fear and the long nights and the uncertainty. And here he finally was. She said his name against the top of his head. Thomas. And the world went completely still. Margaret arrived at the hospital that afternoon. She looked at Thomas briefly, with the particular expression of someone conducting an assessment rather than receiving a gift. She held him for approximately 4 minutes. She handed him back to Sarah without warmth. She spoke with Daniel about logistics. And then on her way out, standing in that room with her newborn grandson in his mother's arms not 3 feet away, she said, I just hope you are ready for what is coming. This is going to be very hard. And it did not have to be. She did not explain. She did not need to. Everyone in the room understood exactly what she meant. She gathered her coat and left. Daniel looked at the floor. Sarah looked at her son. And she made herself a quiet and unbreakable promise that whatever was coming, she would face it. The first months of Thomas's life were simultaneously the hardest and the most clarifying of Sarah's entire life. She threw herself into learning everything available about cerebral palsy, reading every study, consulting every specialist, connecting with communities of parents who were navigating the same terrain. She set up early intervention therapies before Thomas was 3 months old. She modified their home. She tracked his progress with precision and devotion. Her colleagues said that even from a distance, even through the occasional updates she shared, you could feel the ferocity with which she was fighting for her son. She was not waiting for someone to tell her what to do. She was already doing it. Daniel was present but divided. He loved Thomas completely, that was never the question. He sat with him for hours, carried him in the evenings, was tender and attentive in the ways that mattered. But he was a fractured husband. The calls from Margaret had resumed in full force after the birth. They were longer. They came later at night. More than once, Sarah came into the living room to find Daniel speaking in a lowered voice that returned to its normal register the moment he noticed her. More than once she asked what his mother had said and received an answer that was technically a response but was not actually an answer. More than once she felt the loneliness that comes specifically from being in a marriage with someone who is physically present but emotionally split, pulled between the woman he had chosen and the woman who had made him, and who was quietly insisting that choosing anyone else was a form of abandonment. What Sarah did not know, in those months of lowered voices and deflected questions, was what Margaret was actually saying to Daniel during those calls. The full shape of it did not emerge until later. But what it amounted to was this: that Sarah had known about a family medical history she had concealed. That Thomas's condition was something she had brought into their family knowingly and selfishly. That Daniel had been deceived. None of it was true. The medical record was unambiguous. Thomas's cerebral palsy had arisen from a specific and unpredictable complication during a narrow developmental window in the pregnancy, the kind of event that no family history could have foreseen, the kind that no one caused and no one deserved. But Margaret was not interested in what was true. She was interested in the story she had constructed, Because that story gave her a role and a target and a reason to keep calling at 11 o'clock at night with her son's full and conflicted attention. It was in March of 2020, 4 months after Thomas was born, that Sarah sat down alone one evening and wrote. She wrote everything, the 5 words on the phone, the hospital room, the 4 minutes, the coat, the parting shot on the way out the door, the months of lowered voices, the slow erosion of feeling seen or protected in her own marriage. She wrote it for herself, the way you write things that have lived inside you too long and need to be extracted before they do more damage staying in. And then, in a moment of exhaustion and impulse that she would later describe as both the most reckless and most necessary thing she had ever done, she posted it anonymously to a parenting forum she had been following since early in her pregnancy. By morning it had been shared hundreds of times. By the end of the week, hundreds of thousands. People responded not just with sympathy but with recognition, the specific electric recognition of reading something that names a thing you have felt but never had language for. Women from across the country, women from other countries entirely, wrote to say they knew Margaret. That they had sat in that hospital room. That they had heard those words or words just like them. That they had watched their husband look at the floor. The post was picked up by family and parenting websites. A journalist reached out. Therapists who specialized in family systems wrote lengthy responses analyzing what Sarah had described and connecting it to broader patterns in how certain kinds of parents, particularly those who had sacrificed enormously to raise children alone, could struggle to accept that their child's life now belonged to someone else. And then Margaret found it. No one knew exactly how. Perhaps a family acquaintance recognized the details. Perhaps someone who knew both women made the connection. But Margaret found it. And her response was not remorse. It was not recognition. It was rage. She called Daniel at 11 on a Tuesday night and the conversation lasted over an hour. And when Daniel came to bed afterward, he sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark and said nothing for a very long time. What followed over the next several days was the ugliest stretch of that marriage. Everything that had been building for years, every deflected question and lowered voice, every moment of choosing silence over protection, came forward at once. Sarah and Daniel fought in ways they had not fought before. Not loudly. That almost would have been easier. They fought in the quiet, deliberate way of two people who are each carrying something they have not fully said yet, and are trying to figure out whether saying it will save them or end them. Daniel was pulled in 2 directions by 2 women who both needed something from him that he was not sure he knew how to give. His mother needed him to validate her version of events. His wife needed him to reject it. And he was, at his core, a man who had spent most of his adult life trying to avoid exactly this kind of impossible choice. It was Sarah's mother Diane who finally said the thing out loud that no one else had managed to say. She drove from Columbus, sat across from her daughter at the kitchen table, looked her in the eyes and said, "You need to decide what you are willing to live with. Not what you can survive. What you are willing to live with." Those words did not immediately produce an action. They produced a clarity. The slow, quiet kind that arrives not in a confrontation but in an ordinary moment, sitting on the floor with your son while he reaches for a block with his left hand, watching the effort and the concentration and the absolute refusal to stop trying, and understanding suddenly and completely that this is the only thing that matters. This room. This child. This life being built one small reaching motion at a time. And anything that cannot support that is not something you owe your loyalty to. Sarah wrote Daniel a letter. 4 pages, handwritten, left on the kitchen counter one morning before he left for work. She said everything she had not said. About the phone call and the hospital room and the months of silence when she had needed him to speak. She was not only angry in that letter. She was precise. She told him she was not asking him to abandon his mother. She was asking him to see his mother clearly. She was asking him to choose, not between 2 women but between 2 versions of himself. The man who looked at the floor. Or the man who did not. Daniel read it at his desk. His colleague later said he watched him read it twice, sit very still, then pick up his phone. He called Sarah. She did not answer. He called Margaret. That call lasted 11 minutes. And then he drove home in the middle of the afternoon. Something he had never done in 5 years at his firm. He walked through the front door, found Sarah in the living room with Thomas, and sat down on the floor beside them. He said nothing for a while. He watched Thomas reach for something with his left hand. He watched Sarah guide him without rushing. And then he said quietly, "I did not protect you. I am sorry. It was not a resolution. It was not a guarantee. But it was real." And in a story full of things that were not real, false accusations and misplaced blame and the stubborn, damaging fiction that a child's condition was anyone's fault, Daniel began seeing a therapist that spring. The work of untangling what had been built inside him, the devotion to his mother that had calcified over decades into something that looked like love but functioned like obligation, was slow and not always linear. There were weeks of progress and weeks of retreat. There were conversations between him and Sarah that opened things that took a long time to close again properly. But Thomas kept growing. He was the constant. He woke up every morning and reached for the world with both hands, the right one easy and the left one working, always working, with a particular stubborn determination that his therapist said they had rarely seen in a child so young. He began making sounds ahead of schedule. His laugh was enormous and came from somewhere deep and caught everyone around him completely off guard every time. He was curious about everything: light, rain, the faces of people who leaned close enough for him to examine. He did not know about the story surrounding his arrival. He only knew that when he reached for something, his mother's hands were there. Margaret and Daniel eventually had the conversation that needed to happen. He told her that what she had said about Sarah was false, that her claims about Thomas's condition were medically wrong and morally inexcusable, and that if she wanted to remain part of his life and Thomas's life, things would need to genuinely change. Margaret cried. She apologized in the way people apologize when they are not yet fully sure what they are apologizing for, more about her own pain than about the pain she had caused. It was an imperfect apology. It was still an apology. And Sarah, who had more capacity for grace than anyone in this story deserved, chose to receive it. Not because it was enough, but because Thomas would one day understand what family meant, and she wanted him to grow up knowing that the people who loved him had tried, however imperfectly and however late, to choose each other. Thomas Brooks turned 5 years old in November of 2024. His birthday party was held in the backyard of the home his parents had bought the previous year. A small house with a wide yard and a porch that caught the afternoon light just right. There were balloons in every color. There was a cake with a train on it, because Thomas had recently become what his mother called unreasonably passionate about trains. Robert and Diane arrived first and stayed the latest. Margaret arrived with a gift wrapped in blue paper. At one point during the afternoon, she sat beside Sarah and they watched Thomas run. Yes, run. His left leg working harder than his right, but working, always working, across the grass toward Daniel, who caught him and lifted him high while Thomas produced that enormous, room-filling laugh of his. Margaret said. "He is remarkable," Sarah said. "Yes, he is." Neither of them said anything else. It was not warmth exactly, but it was truth. And sometimes, at the end of a story this long, truth is the most honest form of peace available. Because here is what this story is really about, underneath all of the phone calls and the hospital rooms and the posts that circled the internet and the letter on the kitchen counter and the man who finally sat down on the floor. This story is about what happens when fear puts on the mask of blame and walks through the front door of a family. It is about the particular cruelty of making a mother feel that her love for her child is actually her fault. It is about the men caught between two kinds of devotion who take too long to understand that standing in the middle is itself a choice, and not a neutral one. It is about women who carry more than they should and keep showing up anyway. And it is about children, the Thomas Brookses of the world, who arrive in complicated circumstances and proceed, entirely indifferent to those complications, to be magnificent. Margaret Brooks was afraid. That is the most complete and honest thing that can be said about her. She was afraid of what the diagnosis meant for the life she had imagined. She was afraid of losing her son to a reality she had not prepared for. And instead of sitting with that fear and turning it towards something useful, she aimed it at the person who had least deserved it. That is what unexamined fear does. It looks for somewhere to land, and it tends to land on whoever is already carrying the most. Sarah Carter Brooks still works as a nurse. She moved into a specialized unit supporting families of children with developmental differences, a role she sought out partly because of what Thomas had taught her, and partly because of what she had needed in those early months and had not always found, and partly because she believed that the experience she had lived through was worth something to someone else going through the same thing. She speaks about her son with a pride so specific and so total that it is almost impossible to listen to without feeling something shift in your own chest. She speaks about Daniel with honesty, about the work their marriage required and the progress that has been real and the scars that have not disappeared. She speaks about Margaret carefully, without the satisfaction of a villain she gets to dismiss, without performance, without pretense. The way you speak about someone you will never fully understand but have chosen, for the sake of the life you are building, not to hate. So let me ask you this, and I want you to sit with it before you answer. If you had been Daniel, if you had watched the woman you loved be treated the way Sarah was treated, had heard those words and felt that pull between the woman who raised you and the woman who chose you, what would you have done? And how long would it have taken you to do it? Because the truth is, this story does not have a villain who is entirely beyond recognition. It has people who were afraid and people who were brave and people who were somehow both of those things at different times, sometimes on the very same day. And it has a little boy with a train-themed birthday cake, running across the grass with both legs working as hard as they can. And if you ask his mother what she thinks about that, she will tell you, without hesitation, without a shadow of doubt, that he is the whole point. He was always, from the very beginning, the whole point. Drop a comment below and tell us, was Margaret simply a broken woman who did not know how to hold her fear? Or did she go too far past the point of forgiveness? Because people are still talking about this one and we want to know where you stand. And if this story reached somewhere inside you, stay here. Subscribe.